Hello, I hope you can see and hear me well. Thank you so much, Professor Karpenko, for this kind introduction and for this invitation. My greetings to colleagues from a freezing Helsinki. I'm now on a different conference about decolonization of the East, and we just had a roundtable discussion about epistemic imperialism, and that unfortunately precluded my participation online in Paderborn. I know it's not that fascinating to listen to online presentations, but I hope that I will contribute to that, and thank you for this opportunity to share my thoughts. What will follow in the next I think 10 or 15 minutes would be my personal account combined with some attempts or theorizations. And I'm very grateful to the previous speaker because I believe that we have some overlaps in our topics about humanism more specifically. So there are well-known somatic symptoms of a psychic trauma: numbness, dissociation from the body, limited responsiveness to external triggers, tunnel vision, slowing down, or a frozen state of the psyche. There are also oft-discussed reactions to danger: fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Collective traumas enact different mechanisms on the macro level, yet they tend to infuse similar reactions in discrete individuals. I have vague memories of the first day after the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion. Mind you, it caught me in Prague, in an objectively safe environment. Despite that fact, all the signs from the first sentence were there. When I was arguing that Lenin did not, in fact, create Ukraine live on CNN Prima on early Saturday morning, I was as if observing my body from the outside, while my ears felt like being filled with water. I couldn't stop watching frightening scenes on the screen while hearing live sounds of shelling when talking on the phone to my parents in Kharkiv, my hometown. The next day, on Sunday, February 27th, I headed to what turned to be a huge rally on the central square in Prague, in the fight mode, fearful yet determined, equipped with anger, awe, and a handmade banner. After the rally, we had an expected round with my colleagues about recent news and prognosis, updates from our families back in Ukraine. And then suddenly, something shifted. We started recalling the anecdotes that filled social media shortly after the invasion, about a bald lady giving sunflower seeds to a Russian soldier so that when he is buried, something good grows out of him, about a smart countryman pulling an abandoned Russian tank with a tractor, about a sassy woman from Konotop. By the way, many stories were about women indeed. The woman who warned occupants they would get an erectile dysfunction because local women were all witches, and so on and so forth. We couldn't stop laughing. And this laughter not only released the frozen fear and pain from our bodies, but also, most importantly, it gave us hope. Every fight has a strong moral component. Hannah Arendt aptly remarked that force and power are opposite to each other. When brutal force is imposed, its originator exposes his symbolic bankruptcy, his inability to achieve his objectives in other ways. In the current case, also laughter opposed fear. When the aggressor is not feared but laughed at, it signifies his symbolic loss too. The fear has been naturally there. It would have been absurd not to be scared in the face of unimaginable atrocities. But it was mockery and laughter that propped the Ukrainian agency, the conscious choice to resist to what was widely advertised as impossible to resist. The iconic phrase addressing the Russian warship epitomized this resilience. I remember the huge wave of popular jokes during the Maidan movement and plentiful internet memes like the business card of Yarosh in the early days of the Russian invasion back in 2014. Times and again, Ukrainians overcome their fear in the face of a strong enemy, thus proving that both justice and moral prevalence are on their side. Helmut Plessner argues that crying and laughter are two basic modes of human experience in the world. Both of those helped me and my colleagues on that chilly February day to reconnect with our bodies and to keep moving. Sticking to the human per se became the flagship of Ukrainian resistance throughout this macabre war. Everyday actions of Ukrainians discarded geopolitical calculations and rational prognosis, but they also demonstrated the prevalence of humanity over any ideological superstructures. Grieving and hoping, inspired and at times desperate, ordinary citizens help each other and defend what is dear to their hearts. They rescue animals and carry their pets wherever they are forced to go, thereby demonstrating that any life is precious. They plant flowers and repair destroyed buildings, which proves their hopes for the future. They routinely donate to the Ukrainian armed forces and carry disassembled weaponry in their luggage. And most of those things are done without the heroic ethos or pathos. We heard about the banality of evil due to Hannah Arendt, talking about the events of World War II. Michael Billig in mid-90s illuminated us on the banality of nationalism in the post-national era. The unfolding Ukrainian story is for me about the banality of goodness, when essentially courageous, if not outright heroic deeds, are conducted in a matter-of-factly way. This story dates back at least to the days of the Maidan, and it is properly shown, for instance, in Sergei Loznitsa's documentary Maidan. Its large part shows people routinely making sandwiches, building barricades, finding and delivering the required medicine, and so on and so forth. Without knowing the background and the context of the struggle, one wouldn't guess that these mundane activities entail danger and tough moral choices. Truth be told, the Ukrainian resistance in 2022 was framed in the heroic way indeed, like in the state-launched marketing campaign all over the world, "Be brave like Ukraine." But the actions on the ground have not been geared towards that, I argue. And I suggest that they could be best captured by the Aristotelian notion of phronesis, which implies practices aligned with values that originate from the intuitive sense of what feels right at any given moment, without any fixation on the outcome or any prescribed scenario. Post-factum mythologization around the heroic lines is present indeed on various levels, but the practices themselves emerge from the inner calling to do the right thing. The unfolding tragedy ignited frenetic actions also outside Ukraine. When Polish citizens rushed to the Ukrainian border with their cars to pick up refugees, and Czechs, Italians, and other Europeans came to refugee centers with food, toys, and diapers without any order, without coordination or ready-made scripts, it was the very same drive to do something aligned with one's values and beliefs, simply because abstaining felt like a wrong moral choice. It became a commonplace that the Western evaluations proved spectacularly wrong in the estimates of both the Russian military power and the capacity of the Ukrainian resistance. Kyiv was expected to fall within 3 days, and many praised experts reckoned armed resistance futile due to the drastic asymmetry of the military might of the two sides. Ukrainians decided otherwise, both the officials and the citizenry, arguably the former mirroring the latter, not giving orders, not vice versa. Ukrainian border guards refused to surrender to the Russian warship. Ukrainian citizens were trying to stop armored vehicles with bare hands. President Zelensky responded accordingly. The famous claim "we're all here" sealed the deal between the authorities and the citizens that the nation would resist and fight the invasion. Western experts saw in that doomed, even if admirable, heroism, while the Kremlin mouthpieces engaged in conspiracy theories. Multiple and mutual misreadings between Russia, Ukraine, and the so-called collective West, however heterogeneous and vague this label is, were defined by their divergent modes of rationality. Every side was extrapolating its worldview as universal or default model for framing the situation. The main epistemological fallacy of the West is its hegemonic instrumental rationality. Whatever is not pragmatic, which means does not guarantee a desired outcome according to expectations and theoretical extrapolations, is proclaimed absurd and irrational. A telling example of the Western misreading could be in famous op-ed published by Jürgen Habermas last year, where he presented the strategies of the Ukrainian population as a stance of outdated, nationally engaged heroic ethos, misplaced in contemporary Europe. And here I'm quoting, "The more national and more post-national mentalities of populations provide the background for different attitudes toward war in general. This difference becomes clear when one contrasts the widely admired heroic resistance and self-evident willingness to sacrifice displayed by the Ukrainian population with what might be expected of our, generally speaking, Western European populations in a similar situation. End of quotation. There is a number of unquestioned assumptions in this reasoning, the crucial one being that Russia cannot lose, thus the only choice at hand is between a defeat of Ukraine or the escalation of a limited conflict into a third world war. Thus, the realistic attitude should follow the well-known and well-failed strategy of appeasement of the aggressor. The main epistemological fallacy of the Kremlin is the denial of agency to minor actors beyond top officials and great powers. Russian narratives exclusively focused on control centers, be that in the Bankova Street in Kiev or the Washington Obkom Party Committee. As a well-known Ukrainian journalist Natalia Gumenyuk shows in her report on the ground, I'm quoting, Russian occupiers in Ukraine do not understand that local authorities here do not follow orders from the president or security service, but represent communities or their own opinions. Unable to comprehend this freedom of thought, they torture officials and activists, demanding to know who is orchestrating protests in Russian-controlled areas. End of quotation. The West and the Kremlin seem to converge in their instrumental rendering of rationality, where all actions must be performed towards some goal, albeit the goals themselves are proclaimed as drastically different. The continuation of business as usual for the West versus an ultimate disruption that instead shades a new post-Western world order with a new great powers hierarchy. Ukrainians intuitively sensed that both models were disadvantaged to them, either being marginalized as a neglected periphery of the West, at best exploited by the global capital, or even worse, being sacrificed as a disposable resource to rebuild the grandeur of the resentful empire. So they started acting to open up an alternative future, where values could be exercised, not just proclaimed. Importantly, it did not lead to alternative intellectual constructions, but rather to practices centered around values, where the freedom of choice seems to be a necessary prerequisite for others to get traction. In the same important report by Natalia Gumenyuk, she remarks, my circle of friends and I discussed democracy, accountability, and the rule of law, but we long believed we were a minority in Ukraine, that the majority of our compatriots did not care about these abstract terms. Yet in reporting on Putin's invasion, in traveling through my country, I have heard fellow Ukrainians, without any prompting, explain these enormous concepts better than many academics. I listened as those frontline fighters spoke of the freedom to choose who governed them and change course if need be, and the freedom to chart one's own path in life. I heard a mayor say that his town near the Russian border was defending civilization and fighting on behalf of the world where laws matter. A window installer in Odessa on the Black Sea coast told me he had learned how to fire a gun to ensure that he did not have to live in a country where Moscow tells me whom to elect. End of quotation. A story of an ordinary guy posted in the Semantic Corpus project has a telling title. Not everyone is a hero, but everybody is human. Despite the arch framing of the project, which is indeed heroic, this story tells an all too ordinary example of a guy who shied away from going to the front line, who failed to rescue his mother from Mariupol, but just launched a successful volunteer initiative and just went to the occupied territory where he got detained, but luckily escaped. This narrative contains several meaningful points. First, a typical story of a volunteer initiative when a post on a social network fulfilled the set goal of collecting 60,000 Ukrainian hryvnias in just a day. But the most important is the following conclusion, quotation, some can say our hero did wrong, that he had to do nothing, that he put himself in danger in vain. However, Yevhen did as his heart told him, despite criticism. This following the heart is a description of a phronetic action. As Duvinage reminds us, summing up Aristotle's writings and their further interpretations by Gadamer, Arendt, and other scholars, quotation, phronesis is not acquired prescriptively, like the technical skills or the blueprint of the craftsman. It is here not about a means and relationship. Phronesis has no fixed goal or knowledge acquired in advance. It is rather about ethical knowledge, arete, that is formed through our daily exercise of the virtues on the way to the good life. End of quotation. And once we acknowledge that our life worlds are heavily impacted by politics, and refraining from politics as allegedly a playground of corrupt crooks is not an option, then public politics as res publica, concerted actions wired towards the common good, emerges. One might ask any Ukrainian today about their recent experiences, and they would normally give you a handful of amazing stories from their close milieu while taking them as normal behavior. My best friend, a senior executive in a private company in Kyiv, on the very first of the full-scale invasion, was touring the city on her private car to the accompaniment of air raids, attempting to deliver salaries to her employees. I was begging her to take her children and join me in Prague as soon as possible. She responded, "Not before I accomplish this. The war has begun. People are going to need money to save their families. It is my responsibility to provide it to them." A famous female singer with a glamorous image, after several days of staying in a bomb shelter in Kyiv, went as a volunteer to a kitchen where she peeled potatoes for many weeks in a row just to do something useful for those who defend us. It ruined her knuckles, but she just shreds her shoulders, seemingly being at peace with her choices. I am giving these examples of small quotidian deeds as I believe the myriads of them complement more heroic ones, which together generate the reality of the Ukrainian resistance. My parents did eventually move out of Kharkiv upon several weeks of painful negotiations. However, in late August, my mom, who is a university professor, took a trip back to pick up her notes. She is not a person of digital age, so she prepares for the classes using the piles of notes accumulated over decades. Kharkiv is still shelled heavily, and staying safe there is almost like playing a Russian roulette. What an irony, respecting this expression. But a new semester was about to begin at the university, so how could she not be best prepared to deliver to her students, right? I did not aim to praise Ukrainians with this presentation as allegedly exceptionally moral people. I rather suggest this story of resistance to be reckoned as a telling case that illuminates us on some alternative practices that counters many ills of the contemporary society: its selfishness, radical individualism, and greed for profit. Such practices can pop up in various alternative practices, they can pop up in various contexts, especially if properly acknowledged when they do. This being said, phronetic practices tend to appear in the settings where the existing institutional setup is weak and dysfunctional. The very absence of technological, institutionalized, prescribed solutions opens up space where people have to fend for themselves because they have no other choices. But true miracles happen, however, when extra institutional solidarity extends to people outside of traditional networks of personal acquaintance. It invokes a civic as opposed to heroic ethos. It has happened repeatedly in the Ukrainian history as a means of survival when facing existential danger. Counter to multiple claims that Ukrainians have specific democratic instincts, I would focus on the fact that truly mass resistance was always ignited by the situation of not mere threats to democracy, but of existential dangers, when people got assaulted in a cynical way, which put the basic safety of the community at risk. I would give you an example: the kidnapping and murder of the famous journalist Georgy Gongadze, the brutal beating of the student camp on the Maidan, and of course, the military assault of the Russian army. When the institutional design proves unable to find a proper response to an existential challenge, citizens protest and start seeking for ad hoc solutions. Most recently, providing for the army before the state does, which was very important, especially in the very first weeks of the invasion. Interestingly, these practices got disseminated in the army ranks as well. Foreign observers report in disbelief how various army units contact each other to exchange their trophies, which enables them to quickly find missing parts for broken vehicles and weapons and to repair them without any prescriptions from above. There is a Ukrainian saying that could be roughly translated as "necessity is the mother of invention," which might explain the origins of such exceptional creativity. However, In the increasingly turbulent contemporary world, where the scale of challenges, the ecological drama of the Anthropocene, the ever-growing global inequality, to give you just a few examples, this situation and this turbulent world, full of dangers, requires truly consolidated responses, not backed up by any existing institutional solutions. And in this context, we might all need to engage into phronetic practices. With no blueprints at hand, just focusing on our priorities of common survival and aligning our actions with our values. Current Ukrainian resistance might provide an example to be closely examined to that end. Thank you for your attention.